Come, settle in now. Let us begin gently. This is a story of a marriage built on paper and what grew in the silence between two careful people. Eleanor Marsh was 24 years old and running very nearly out of money on a Tuesday in November. She sat at her father's writing desk and sorted the coins from her thin purse, one by one, upon the green leather. The desk had belonged to the vicarage for longer than she had lived in it. The candle at her elbow was a stub. She had one more stub in the drawer, and after that there were no more. She did not hurry. She counted the coins, noted the sum in her commonplace book, and replaced each one without dramatics. There was no one to perform for. Her father had been dead since February. Her sister Harriet slept upstairs, tired from mending. The vicarage itself seemed to lean inward against the cold, as if it too were holding its breath against the coming winter, and its silence. Eleanor was not a handsome woman, and she knew it without particular sorrow. She was spare and dark. Ink stained the inside of her right wrist and would not fully wash away. Her left cuff was darned and turned twice, hiding where the thread had thinned. She sat, however, as her father had always sat, straight-backed, with her chin level, as though the posture were the last thing she owned outright. In a manner of speaking, it was. A knock came at the front door at 3:30. She heard Mrs. Holt, who came 3 mornings a week, admit someone and exchange low words. Then Mrs. Holt appeared in the study doorway with the expression she wore when the visitor was a gentleman. He was a solicitor from London, a thin man with good gloves and careful eyes. He introduced himself as Mr. Crail of Crail and Pemberton. He did not sit when Eleanor offered the chair opposite. He drew a letter from his case and presented it. He had altogether the air of a man who had been paid not to comment on what he carried. She recognized the seal before she broke it. The Ashworth crest was a hawk above a chevron. It was the kind of thing one learned in the county simply by accumulation. One came to know the names of great houses without ever being invited to them. Lord Edward Ashworth, Earl of Pembrook, was spoken of in the neighbourhood with a particular blend of respect and wariness. He was a man of real consequence. He was not known for warmth. She had never met him. She had no occasion to. She was a vicar's daughter with an empty purse and a leaking roof above the east bedroom. The crest, then, in her cold study on a November afternoon, produced in Eleanor a feeling she could not immediately name. Not excitement. Something quieter than that and considerably cooler. A species of foreknowledge. A premonition, perhaps. The sense that the room had already shifted before she understood why. She broke the seal and read. The letter was brief. Lord Ashworth wrote that he found himself in need of a wife, or, more precisely, his solicitor had written this, and Lord Ashworth had signed. The effect was the same. The requirements were particular. The lady should be of quiet character, of good sense, and of no notable connections. The arrangement his lordship wished to make plain would be entirely nominal. She would live at Ashworth Hall. She would want for nothing reasonable. There would be no society obligations beyond what any countess might expect. He asked only her name, her answer, and her understanding that this was a matter of practical necessity. He was the Earl of Pembrook. He had signed his name in a hand that was firm and gave nothing away. Eleanor read the letter to the end. She set it on the desk. She looked at Mr. Crail, who was still standing. She looked at the coins arranged beside her commonplace book. She looked at the candle, which had perhaps another half-hour left in it, if that. Then she picked the letter up and read it again from the beginning. The second reading did not change anything. It confirmed that she had understood it correctly. It meant what it appeared to mean: a great lord with reasons she did not yet know. A marriage in name, a life made considerably different from this one. She thought of the second candle stub in the drawer. She thought of the leaking roof above the east bedroom and the cold that crept through at the join. She folded the letter along its original crease, as her father had taught her to handle documents that mattered. She placed it on the desk. She rested her hand upon it for a moment, not theatrically, simply steadying herself against the quiet weight of what came next. Outside, November pressed against the glass and kept its own counsel still. Inside, the candle burned a little lower. The carriage set her down on a street of pale stone and cold November light. Eleanor Marsh looked up at Ashworth House. The house returned her gaze with the patience of something that had outlasted a great many visitors before. A footman received her card without expression and led her inside. She passed through an entrance hall where the floorboards had been waxed to a deep, long-accustomed shine. The smell reached her at once. Beeswax, and beneath it old velvet, and something else harder to name, the accumulated quiet of rooms that had held many decisions. The curtains in the ante-room were a dark red, faded now to the shade of dried rose petals. A fire had been laid in the grate with considerable care. The logs were arranged neatly, and the paper was twisted beneath them in precise white coils. But the fire had not been lit. Eleanor noted this the way one notes anything that may later prove meaningful. She sat in the chair she was shown to, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. Lord Edward Ashworth came in without announcement. He was 32. He had a face that was not severe by intention, only by long disuse of ease. Tall, dressed in black cloth, the white of his cravat the sole relief from it. He moved with an economy that came not from ease, but from the long practice of a man grown tired of being watched. He did not rise when she entered. Then he corrected himself and stood, and that brief correction was the only evidence of discomfort she would see from him for some while. He gestured toward the chair she had already taken. Then he positioned himself near the cold fireplace and remained standing. "You have read the letter," he said. It was not a question. "I have, my lord." He turned toward the unlit grate rather than at her. She could not yet determine whether this was a species of consideration or simply the habit of a man who thought more clearly when not being observed in return. "I will not obscure the matter," he said. "It concerns my late brother, Thomas." He said the name with a careful evenness, and she heard the labour that evenness had required. 2 years ago Thomas formed an attachment in the county. The young woman was not in a position to withstand it. A settlement was arranged. Funds, passage, what silence money could purchase. She left England. The talk, however, did not leave with her. A pause of several seconds. It remained here, and in the absence of Thomas, it has settled upon me. Eleanor listened without altering her expression. "My legal counsel advises that a marriage, unremarkable, above reproach, would extinguish what remains of the rumour more effectively than any other course." He turned then and looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were grey and still, and gave up nothing. "You have, I am told, a blameless reputation and no notable connections to complicate the arrangement. I require a wife who will not attract notice." "I see," Eleanor said. A short silence fell between them, and in exchange, a household allowance, the standing of my name, a position in society, every reasonable comfort. She was still for a moment in the manner of a woman choosing her words, not from uncertainty, but from care. "I have conditions of my own," she said. He was very still. She thought she was probably the first person in some time to have said that to him. "My sister Harriet lives at my father's vicarage in Wiltshire. I require the living to remain secure for so long as my father holds the position. When he does not, provision for my sister must be set in writing, no less than £40 per annum. I will not trust this matter to goodwill alone." She met his gaze without difficulty and did not feel the silence that followed. Furthermore, the household allowance should be named as a figure, a precise sum. "I will not manage a house of this scale on an amount I am expected to infer." The silence that followed was not hostile. It was the silence of a man quietly revising what he had prepared to say. "You understand," he said at last, "that this will not be a marriage in any genuine sense." "I understand what you require, my lord." She did not look away. "I am asking whether you understand what I require." A pause. She waited. "Name it," he said. "I have named it." He regarded her for a moment. Something shifted in the set of his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a small and involuntary recalibration. He had arrived expecting a formality. He had encountered instead a negotiation conducted with equal composure. He was not, she thought, displeased by this. There was, perhaps, in some carefully sealed quarter of him, something like relief. "The vicarage is secured," he said. "The allowance will be fixed in writing before the week is out, with the figure specified." "Then we are in agreement," Eleanor said, and rose. They did not shake hands. There was no occasion for it. The footman was summoned. She was led back through the quiet hall and out into the street, where the November air received her, with its same grey indifference. She drew her coat more closely about her. The street was still. She did not look back at the house. Behind the tall windows of Ashworth House, the fire in the ante-room remained exactly as she had found it, laid with great care, the paper white and patient beneath the arranged logs, and entirely, stubbornly unlit. The church held 6 people and a cold that had lived in the stone since October. There were no flowers. There was no music. The hymnals lay closed in the pews, as if they too had been informed that no singing was required. A single candle burned on the altar. Its wax had been running long before Eleanor arrived. She stood beside Edward Ashworth in her second-best grey dress, gloves folded at the fingers, while the vicar, a man who had known her since she was 7, read the words with a gentleness he did not let show in his face. Harriet stood at Eleanor's left. Just before the binding vow, she pressed something into Eleanor's gloved hand. Eleanor looked down. It was a small sprig of winter rosemary, the kind that grew along the path to their father's church. Grey-green, sharp, and very much alive. Harriet said nothing. Eleanor closed her fingers around it. The small exchange was complete. The bells did not ring. The village clock did. Once the ceremony was finished, a thin measured peal that counted the hour and stopped, as if it too had decided not to make an occasion of the thing. Edward handed Eleanor into the carriage with the care of a man who had thought in advance about where his hands should fall. He sat across from her. They did not speak for the first 2 hours. The landscape changed slowly. Then all at once, London thinned to suburb and suburb to open country, and somewhere in the long middle of the afternoon the hills began to stiffen. The sky pressed lower with each mile, a uniform grey that had no interest in drama. She had never come this far north. The fields along the road grew lean and pale, stripped of everything the summer had lent them. She watched the moor arrive, treeless, enormous, indifferent, and felt, not for the first time that day, that she had agreed to something she could not yet fully measure. The rosemary was still in the pocket of her cloak. She did not take it out. She knew exactly where it was. Ashworth Hall came into view as the light began to fail. 3 wings of pale stone rose against a darkening sky, each window frost-rimed and blank, giving nothing back. The drive was frozen gravel, and the carriage wheels ground across it, with a sound she thought, without meaning to, was like an apology, not to her but to the house itself, for arriving at all. She pressed her gloved hand to the window glass. The cold came through at once. Edward had said nothing since the second change of horses. When the carriage stopped, he descended first, then turned to offer her his hand. She took it, stepped down, and looked up at the hall. The hall did not look back. Houses seldom do on first acquaintance, but she had the distinct sense that something old and very still, somewhere behind those frost-rimed windows, was paying close attention. Mrs. Cavendish was waiting on the front step. She was small and sharp-eyed, with the bearing of a woman who had been in service so long that the house had grown around her like a second skin. She curtsied to Eleanor with correctness and without warmth, the curtsy of a woman who is still deciding what she is curtsying to. "My lady," she said. Then she spoke something low to Edward that Eleanor could not hear. He nodded once and went inside. Mrs. Cavendish led Eleanor through the main hall, high-ceilinged, cold, lit by lamps that made more shadow than light, and up a broad staircase to the east wing. She opened a door onto rooms that smelled of lavender bags and long disuse. The curtains were heavy and pale and had been drawn against the winter for some time. The fire in the grate was newly set and barely catching. "These were the previous Lady Ashworth's rooms," said Mrs. Cavendish. "They have not been opened in some years. I have had them aired as best we could." Eleanor looked at the mantelpiece. There was a mark on the marble where something had once stood and been removed. She did not ask what it had been. They dined at 8. The table sat 20, and they occupied opposite ends of it, with the full length of the room between them. The silver, the candlesticks, the soup tureen, the empty chairs. A footman stood at each end of the table. They were very young. Neither looked at the far end. They had been instructed not to look at anything in particular, and they followed the instruction carefully. Edward looked up at the start of the meal. "I trust the rooms are adequate." Eleanor said they were very comfortable. He inclined his head. She reached for her wine. That was the end of conversation for the evening. The soup was replaced by a fish course and the fish by meat, each remove arriving and departing with the footman moving between them like a man at a very quiet ceremony he had not chosen. The candles burned. The fire at the far end crackled. The clock on the sideboard ticked out the minutes steady and indifferent. She held her posture and ate what was placed before her. She did not look at the empty chairs. She thought of Harriet's rosemary, still in her cloak pocket upstairs, still sharp, still alive. It was a small thing to have carried into the house, but the house was cold and very large, and she had carried it deliberately. Small things, she had learned in the vicarage, could carry a person through a great deal. The morning arrived with frost still pressed against the panes of the east wing, and the house held its cold, as if reluctant to release it. Eleanor had slept in brief intervals, waking to the unfamiliar silence that was not silence at all, but the particular voice of Ashworth Hall settling around her. She dressed without assistance, a habit of long standing, and came down to find a fire already laid in the breakfast room, and no one else at table. She waited. She ate alone. The footman moved as if she were not there. Edward appeared at 9:30 and entered the library with the air of a man who had arranged the morning in advance. He did not sit. Eleanor understood she was expected to remain standing also. He began with the practical matters in a tone that was neither cold nor warm, but carefully regulated, as a man might regulate a clock he did not entirely trust. "Dinner is served at 7, he said. "I take it in the dining-room, company or none. Sunday service at the village church I attend without fail and expect the same. When entertainments are required by the county's season, I shall give you sufficient advance notice." He paused, and something shifted, almost imperceptibly at the edge of his composure. "Otherwise, your time is your own." Eleanor listened until he was finished. Then she asked, quite simply, whether she might make use of the library. The brevity of his "of course" told her it was not the question he had braced himself against. She was not certain what he had expected. Something more demanding, perhaps, something requiring a considered refusal. He looked at her for a moment longer than the question warranted, then gave a short nod and excused himself. The door closed quietly behind him. She stood in the silence he had vacated and then turned to the nearest shelf. The spines were fine and uniform, the collection of a man who purchased books because they were expected and perhaps occasionally read them. She found a volume on botany with illustrations in hand-coloured plates. She tucked it under her arm and began to learn the house. She was mapping it for warmth, not for grandeur. The entrance hall was lost, too high and too open to the winter air that found its way under the front door. The morning room faced north. The drawing room was vast, and she disliked it immediately. But the kitchen passage, which ran the length of the house behind the service stairs, held a fine, steady warmth from the great range that burned through the night and never quite let it go. And above the boiler, on the half-landing, a linen room stored sheets in lavender bundles, and the heat rose through the floorboards in a steady, gentle column, reliable as bread. Best of all was the east corridor, where a wide window seat caught what little winter sun the hall permitted, and kept it long into the afternoon. She settled herself there with the botanical volume and the light that remained. Mrs. Cavendish found her an hour later. The housekeeper arrived without summons, carrying a tray with tea for one, a cup without its proper saucer, an honest oversight, and a plate of shortbread that had been set out and then clearly reconsidered and included after all. "His lordship takes his in the study," Mrs. Cavendish said, setting the tray on the window ledge with the precision of a woman who did everything precisely. Her manner suggested she was offering information rather than making a comparison. Eleanor considered the information. And where did the previous countess take hers? A beat passed. It was a small interval, not long enough to suggest reluctance, but distinct enough to suggest thought. "She did not as a rule," said Mrs. Cavendish. Eleanor wrapped both hands around the cup. The tea was very hot and the corridor was not yet fully warm, and the heat moved through her palms and into the cold that had settled somewhere in her chest since the evening before. She did not ask anything further. Mrs. Cavendish withdrew without the stiffness one might have expected and without the softness one might have hoped for. Both of those things, Eleanor thought, were probably to her credit. She read until the light began to fail. The botanical illustrations were precise and careful. The handwritten annotations in a margin she gradually understood were not the printer's, but some former reader's, a close observation in faded brown ink about the root structure of wild garlic. She read that note 3 times. Someone had stood in a field or a garden with this book open and cared enough to write in it. She liked them without knowing them. She lit the lamp when the corridor grew too dim to read without it. The flame steadied and the frost outside thickened as the sun went. She did not hear him until the footstep paused. Edward had come along the east corridor at dusk, as perhaps he often did. She had no way of knowing the established patterns of a house that had been someone else's for the whole of its history. He did not announce himself. He did not speak. But she was acutely aware of the pause in the footstep, the small arrested moment in the passage before the sound resumed, and he walked quietly on. She did not look up from her page. It seemed, in some way she could not quite name, important not to look up. The lamp burned. The corridor held its quiet. And somewhere further along the house a door opened and closed, and that too was a kind of answer. The east corridor held its cold long after the rest of Ashworth Hall had relented. Eleanor had learned this in the first week, not from being told, but from moving through it enough times that its habits became her own. She carried her tea from the kitchen passage each morning. She settled into the east window seat as the light came in grey and reluctant. She read until the cold climbed through the cushion and into her bones. The garden below was still frozen. The frost had not yet released from the lower panes. The book was simply there. She had not placed it. She was certain of this before she even set down her cup. She was the sort of person who remembered where she had put things, particularly things she had not yet allowed herself to own. It was a slim volume bound in green cloth, the gilt of the title worn, but legible, an account of botanical illustration from the previous century. The engravings were of such exactness that the veins of each leaf were rendered as finely as thread. She had lingered over the library's copy 2 days before. She had stood at the shelf longer than was strictly necessary. She had run one finger along the spine and then replaced it without taking it down. She sat for a moment without opening it. It was possible Mrs. Cavendish had tidied it here. It was possible a housemaid had moved it without understanding what she carried. There were a number of polite explanations available to her. She considered each of them with the same patience. She had once applied to household accounts that would not balance. None of them persuaded her. She knew how a house spoke. She was beginning in these early weeks at Ashworth Hall to learn how its master spoke as well. He communicated in objects placed without acknowledgement, in absences shaped with care. She opened the book instead. Reading, she had discovered, was its own kind of reply. She was still there 2 hours later when she heard his step. It was a tread she had come to distinguish from the footman's lighter pace, from Mrs. Cavendish's purposeful click, from the sound of the house simply shifting in the cold. He entered from the inner door. She saw the brief arrest of his expression, not displeasure, a quiet recalibration. "I did not know you had come here," he said. It was not a reproach. She began to close the book and rise. "I can return to my rooms. Stay." He said it simply, and not unkindly. He crossed to the great mahogany correspondence table at the room's far end. She heard the soft protest of the leather chair as he settled. She heard the dry whisper of papers being sorted. They read in the same room for the better part of an hour. It was, Eleanor found, a companionable silence, or something near enough to it that she did not feel inclined to examine the distinction. She turned pages. He wrote letters she could hear him setting aside. The house was quiet around them, not the silence of the first evening at dinner, which had been the silence of two people performing an absence, something more natural, like snow settling, like frost releasing from the glass. 1812, he said, without looking up. She blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The publication date," you read aloud. "The Kew Commission for that volume was completed in 1810. It was not published until 1812. You said 1811. She looked at the page. He was quite right. 1812, she agreed. "Thank you." He did not reply. She returned to her reading. A few minutes later she encountered a footnote of such magnificent pedantry that she laughed before she could prevent herself. It concerned the Latin naming of a flowering shrub from the Cape Colony. The shrub had been renamed 3 times in 11 years by 3 separate botanists. Each had apparently failed to read the preceding 2. The sound of her laughter surprised her. She touched the page. "Forgive me," she said. Then, without quite deciding to, she turned the book so that he might read the footnote. He came to the table's edge and read it. One corner of his mouth moved. It was the smallest possible concession to amusement. It was entirely unperformed. He went back to his letters. They said no further word to one another for the remainder of the hour. When at last he rose to go, she marked her place. She accompanied him as far as the doorway, where the corridor turned cold again. "The botanical volume," she said. Her voice was composed. "Was it intentional?" He stopped with his back still to her. His hand rested on the door frame. A brief pause occupied the air between them, long enough to be an answer in itself. "The library belongs to the house," he said. "I was not aware I needed to curate it." He walked on. She stood in the doorway and watched the corridor close around him, steady and unhurried. She understood the reply as plainly as if he had turned and spoken it directly. She stood there a moment longer. One hand came to rest on the cold stone of the frame where his had been. That night, she carried the book back to the east window seat. She set it on the sill where the lamplight would catch the green cloth and the worn gilt of the title. She left the lamp burning a little longer than she needed to. In the way of someone who has learned a new language and would very much like to practice it. The morning arrived with a pale, windless quiet, the kind that settled over Ashworth Hall like held breath. Eleanor had been at the window seat since first light, the botanical volume open across her knee, the lamp unnecessary now that the grey sky offered its thin illumination through the frost-edged glass. She had read the same passage 3 times. She was not, in truth, reading. The sound of wheels on frozen gravel reached her before the knock at the hall door. She did not know Lady Cecily Rowan by sight. She knew her by reputation, which in a county the size of Pembrook served the same purpose. The finest conversationalist in 3 parishes, it was said. She received callers like a general surveys terrain, and was known in polite language as the sharpest judge of persons in the county. Eleanor straightened her cuffs and went downstairs. There were 3 of them, Lady Cecily and 2 companions whose names were offered and gently forgotten. They filled the drawing-room with the particular energy of women who understood precisely how to fill a room. Their gowns were of a quality Eleanor had no occasion to match. She did not, in that moment, wish to. She rang for tea and settled opposite her guests with the expression of a woman who has learned to keep her hands still. Lady Cecily Rowan was 30 years of age and dressed with an art that made the fact seem a conquest. Her eyes were the colour of pale sherry and moved with extraordinary speed. They moved over Eleanor now, the plain morning dress, the hair pinned without decoration, the darned cuff turned twice at the wrist, with the efficiency of a woman cataloguing unexpected furniture in a room she had expected to know. "What a charming aspect," Lady Cecily said, settling her gaze at last on the east window. "The hall is always lovelier in the cold months. The summer softens it too much." She smiled at Eleanor with perfect warmth. "And you, Lady Ashworth, Edward has kept you rather to himself. We have all been most curious." Eleanor poured the tea without hurrying. "I am afraid I have been an unremarkable addition to the county. We have been very quietly settled." "How extraordinary," Cecily said, accepting her cup, "that Edward found someone so entirely unencumbered by society. It must be restful for him." The pause before restful was very small. Eleanor heard it clearly. "I find it suits us very well," Eleanor said. She met the pale, sherry eyes. "Encumbrances are so fatiguing." The smile held. The eyes shifted, briefly, to the darned cuff, then returned. "Quite," said Lady Cecily, and sipped her tea, and turned to one of her companions, and began to speak of quite another subject entirely. The examination was complete. The conversation moved through 20 minutes of county matters, a disputed boundary, a cousin's engagement, the condition of the Keaton Road after the frost. Eleanor listened, and contributed where courtesy required. She mentioned nothing personal. She offered no opening. She was aware of being measured, and she declined to provide any further instruments for the purpose. The drawing-room door opened, and Edward entered. His timing was not accidental. Eleanor understood this only later, when she had time to think quietly at the east window. He had been in the house all along. He had heard the carriage arrive on the gravel. His manner with Lady Cecily was a sealed, civil surface that would not yield at a single point. He bowed correctly. He answered questions with the minimum of sufficient warmth. He took no tea. He stood at an angle that placed Eleanor slightly ahead of him, an arrangement anyone else would have overlooked. Eleanor did not overlook it. Something moved at the edge of her understanding, a shape she could not yet name. There was a history in this room she had not been given, and its outline pressed faintly against Lady Cecily's conversation, like a figure behind clouded glass. She filed it in the careful library she kept of things not yet explained. After 40 minutes, Lady Cecily gathered her companions with the practised ease of a woman who knows precisely when she has accomplished her purpose. She embraced the air near Eleanor's cheek. She said, "How delightful." She said they must arrange a proper evening, all the county together. She looked, once more, at Eleanor with those pale, quick eyes, and then she was gone. The hall door closed, the sound of wheels diminished on the frozen gravel. Ashworth Hall settled back into its particular silence, the kind it kept between events, patient as stone. Edward stood at the window with his hands folded behind his back. He looked out at the drive. Eleanor collected the teacups onto the tray, a small domestic action that bought her the moment she needed. She moved to rise from the low chair, and he spoke without turning. "You held your ground well," he said. It was the most personal thing he had said to her, since the day she named her terms in a London room where the fire was not lit. It was spoken to the window, to the white January sky, to Lady Cecily's carriage diminishing on the moor road. Eleanor did not answer immediately. She considered the shape behind the clouded glass and let it remain clouded because it was not yet time and because some things asked to be understood slowly. "I had a good position," she said at last. "I was in my own home." She set the tray by the door. The house was quiet. Outside, the pale sky did not release its snow. The frost had not lifted by Thursday. The study smelled of old ink and cold stone. Mrs. Cavendish stood in the doorway with her hands folded at her waist. It was the way she stood when she had already decided something and was waiting for permission to act. "His late lordship's correspondence has not been touched," she said. "It would be appropriate, I think, if someone set it in order. The solicitor has already taken what was needed." She paused. "I could ask Mr. Renfrew to see to it, but he did not know Mr. Thomas well." Eleanor understood the offer without naming it. "I will see to it," she said. The study was at the back of the north wing where the sun reached it only in June. Today it gave nothing. The fireplace had not been lit. Eleanor built a small fire herself because Mrs. Cavendish was already gone, and she did not wish to ring. The kindling caught slowly, as if the room were suspicious of warmth. Thomas Ashworth's desk was not what she had expected. There were no hunting ledgers, no shooting accounts. There were novels, 3 of them, open at the spine as if recently set down. There was a letter half composed to a tailor in Edinburgh. Beneath the shallow drawer, tucked at an angle as if placed in haste, was a folded sheet, sealed only with a wafer. The name on the outside was written in a hand she did not yet know. Miss Mary Heaton, Calder Street. She did not open it. She set it down and stood at the window. The frost was making slow patterns on the glass. They branched outward like the diagrams in the botanical volume she had read 3 times now. Then she picked it up again. The seal was dry and broke without effort. Thomas's prose was careless and hurried. He wrote as men write when they believe themselves beyond consequence. The opening lines described the necessity of discretion. The middle lines explained that certain arrangements had been made for Miss Heaton's comfort, and continued silence. The closing lines thanked her for her good sense. It was not signed. Eleanor sat down in Thomas's chair. The fire was beginning to take. She read the letter again, more slowly this time. Then she opened the shallow drawer and found, beneath a ribbon of dried lavender, a small account book in a different hand entirely. The sums were Edward's. She knew his writing from the household ledgers she had countersigned. £40 in autumn, 20 in winter. A note in the margin read only, "Heaton, settled." She sat in the cold study for a very long time. The fire had settled to a quiet burn, and the room was almost warm. The truth arranged itself without her asking. Thomas had ruined a girl and refused to act. Edward had acted quietly, paying from his own account, and had let the county attach the rumour to himself. He had done it before their mother died, she thought, so the woman need not know what her younger son had been. He had carried another man's guilt for 2 years. He had married Eleanor to remedy what he could not undo. Outside, the frost continued its slow work on the glass. She put the letter and the account book back in the shallow drawer and closed it. The fire was warm now. She stood, pressed her palms flat on the desk for a moment, then walked out of the study and did not look back. She found him in the stables. She had suspected she would. He was doing something unnecessary with a bridle. It was the kind of task a man turns to when he wishes to be occupied and not spoken to. He heard her cross the yard and did not turn. "I was sorting Thomas's correspondence," she said. He set the bridle down. "You were not meant to find that." "No, but I did." He turned then. His face was careful. The way his face was careful when he was deciding how much to give and had settled on very little. "It changes nothing in our arrangement," he said. She looked at him steadily. "It changes how I understand it." He said nothing for a moment. A horse moved in the stall beside them, and the sound was ordinary and unhurried. Then Edward turned back to the bridle, though he did not pick it up. Eleanor crossed the frozen yard alone. Her boots were loud on the frozen gravel. The cold was sharp beneath the grey sky, and her breath came in small, quiet clouds. She was thinking of the £40 in the margin. She was thinking of a man who had attended his brother's funeral, and then quietly settled the debt of it. He had told no one. He had married a vicar's daughter, so the county would look elsewhere. He had continued to manage the hall, the tenants, the obligations, all of it, in the same silence. There were men who would have told that story to every drawing-room in the county. Edward had folded it into a desk drawer and left it for the frost. Something settled in her chest on the walk back to the house. It was not gratitude. It was not pity. It was heavier than either, and quieter, and she did not yet have a name for it. She only knew that it was not duty. She had felt duty before, and it did not press like this. She climbed the stone steps, and the door opened before she reached it, as if the house had been watching for her return. The frost that had settled over Ashworth Hall in the days since Eleanor's visit to the stables did not lift. It deepened, pressing against the east wing windows until the glass held a skin of ice at its corners each morning. It was Mrs. Cavendish who first noticed Eleanor's colour at breakfast, the high flush in her cheeks that was not warmth but fever. She said nothing at once. She carried the tea-tray herself, which was unusual, and pressed the back of her hand briefly to Eleanor's forehead as she set down the pot. "You will go to your rooms," Mrs. Cavendish said, in the tone that admitted no revision. "I'm quite well," Eleanor said. "You are not," said Mrs. Cavendish. "You are quite determined, which is a different thing entirely." The fever was not alarming. Dr. Fellows called from the village the following morning, described it as a chill caught from the cold passages, and advised rest, warm broths, and no correspondence until the 2nd week. Eleanor accepted this verdict with more grace than she felt. Her east wing rooms were comfortable enough. The fire was kept banked, the curtains drawn against the white glare of the frozen garden, and Mrs. Cavendish appeared at intervals with efficiency and very little conversation. Eleanor read when her head permitted and slept when it did not. On the second evening, when the light had faded to a grey nothing at the curtain's edge, there came a knock at the door that was not Mrs. Cavendish's knock. She recognised the difference. It had a shorter pause before the sound, a different weight. "Come in," she said. Edward Ashworth stood in the doorway with a book held loosely in one hand. He was in his evening coat, though there was no occasion that evening requiring it. He looked, she searched for the word, careful, as though he had rehearsed the right degree of concern and was determined to stop precisely there. "Mrs. Cavendish tells me you are improving," he said. "She is generous. I am neither improving nor worsening, which I understand to be the most respectable state to occupy." Something in the careful expression shifted, very slightly, toward amusement. He moved into the room and glanced at the small table beside her chair, where a single volume lay open and face down. "Can you read?" "When the light holds." "My eyes tire." He offered the book in his hand. It was a volume she had not seen before, a collection of sermons bound in old brown calfskin. "I noticed the one you had there was the sort that demands argument, perhaps something quieter." He said it in the manner of a man who was being simply practical. "I could read to you if that would help. It is of no trouble." Eleanor looked at him. She said yes, before she had finished deciding whether to. He sat in the chair that stood at an angle to the hearth and opened the sermons, and he read. His voice was low. It was a reading voice she had not heard before, careful, unhurried, moving through each sentence with a steadiness that suggested he had once read aloud a great deal and then, for reasons she could guess at, had stopped. The sermons themselves were exactly what she might have expected, earnest, heavily scriptural, somewhat tedious in their conviction. But she did not listen to the words. She listened to the cadence. She lay with the coverlet across her lap and felt the fever sit quietly behind her eyes and let his voice fill the room, and the house around them was silent, and the frost pressed at the glass, and she did not think of anything at all. He returned the next evening, and the evening after. On the third night, Eleanor was well enough to sit upright against the pillows without effort, and the firelight was steadier, and she had the presence of mind to follow the sermon's argument rather than merely its sound. Edward read a passage in which the author described earthly suffering as evidence of divine patience, with a certainty that left very little room for disagreement. He stopped at the end of the page. "You find him insufferable too," Eleanor said. Edward looked up from the book. "I find him earnest beyond the evidence." She laughed. It was not a small, cautious laugh. It was the real thing, sudden and unguarded, and she felt it do her good in a way that 3 days of broth and rest had not managed. She put her hand over her mouth after, which was rather too late. She looked at Edward. Something in his face had changed. A fastening of some kind had come undone, not all at once, but in the manner of something that had held for a long time, and simply found it could not hold any longer. He looked at her with an expression she had no precedent for in his face, though she thought she understood it. He glanced back at the book and turned the page. He read until the fire began to die down. When he rose to leave, he set the volume on the table beside her chair, without comment. She did not ask him to leave it, and he did not explain. He said good night in the voice he used at dinner, correct and even, and closed the door behind him. Eleanor lay awake in the dark for some time after. She had told herself throughout the weeks of their arrangement that the feeling accumulating in her was gratitude for his restraint, or relief at her improved circumstances, or some other quality that could be named and set aside. She lay awake now and named it differently. The house had a different quality at this hour, not silence exactly. Ashworth Hall was never fully silent, but a settling, as if the stone itself had drawn a slow breath and held it. Eleanor lay awake, listening to the frost's small contractions in the window glass, the low complaint of the east corridor's floorboards, releasing the day's cold. Sleep would not come. It had not come easily since the fever broke, which she told herself was merely the body's slow retreat from illness. She did not examine that explanation too closely. She heard it just past midnight. A single chord, low and sustained, rising from somewhere below, a careful sound, like a question posed to an empty room. Then silence. Then the chord again, as if whoever played it was testing whether it still sounded the same as it once had. Eleanor rose. She wrapped her shawl about her shoulders and took the lamp from the writing desk. The east corridor was very cold. The music room lay at the far end of the ground floor passage, behind a door she had not seen opened since her arrival. It was open now by just a hand's breadth, and through it fell the faint, amber suggestion of a fire banked very low. She pushed the door without knocking. Edward sat at the pianoforte, with his back to her, dressed still in his day coat as if he had not attempted to sleep. The instrument was a fine one, rosewood, she thought, with brass fittings tarnished to a soft gold, and the sheet music propped above the keys was marked with pencil annotations in a hand she did not recognize. His own hands rested flat on the closed cover, not playing. He had heard her come in. He turned without alarm, which she noted as its own kind of admission. "I'm sorry," she said. "I heard something and thought I ought to investigate." He shook his head. "I ought to have closed the door." She came further into the room. The fire was indeed low, and the cold lived here more than elsewhere. The particular cold of a room kept shut. A portrait above the mantelpiece showed a woman she had not seen before, seated at this same instrument, her head turned slightly as if toward the sound of something approaching. "Did she play often?" Eleanor asked. "Every evening before dinner." He looked at the sheet music rather than at Eleanor, a habit she had kept since she was a girl. "I have not opened this room since she died." Eleanor set her lamp on the side table nearest the fire. She did not ask how long ago that was. She did not need to. "I lost my father in February," she said. "He used to read aloud at night, history mostly. Dull county histories he found enormously interesting. He had a particular voice for the dramatic passages." She paused. "When he was gone, the house was very loud afterwards, in the way that quiet can be loud." Edward looked at her then properly, the first time he had done so in what felt like some days. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly it." They were quiet together for a moment. Eleanor took the chair nearest the instrument and drew her shawl closer. He did not return to the keys. "The annotations," she said presently, "are they hers?" She marked the passages she found difficult. She said it was better to make visible what was hard than to pretend the difficulty was not there. Eleanor did not reply at once. She thought it a considerable philosophy for the application of fingering marks. They spoke then in the careful way of two people discovering they share a language neither had expected the other to know. He told her, of his mother's habit of stopping mid-phrase when she was pleased with a chord, holding it until it dissolved. She told him how her father would lose his place and begin the same paragraph a second time, not knowing, and how she and Harriet had come to love the repeated passage best. Loss, she was beginning to understand, had a grammar of its own. One learned to speak it quietly. One learned to hear it in others. The fire burned lower. Neither of them moved to add wood. The lamp on the side table drew their shadows long across the wall. Sometime in the second hour he laid one hand on the keys, not pressing them, simply resting there, the ivory cool beneath his fingers. She did not remark on it. She had thought, before tonight, that the distance he kept between himself and every room he occupied was something like coldness, a constitutional remove, the formal habit of a man schooled to hold himself apart. She understood now that she had mistaken the thing. He was not cold. He was careful. He was the caution of a man who had lost, one after another, the people he had not been quick enough or watchful enough to keep. He had learned to stand a little apart, so that the losing, when it came again, would not undo him entirely. She thought she understood that posture. It was not unlike her own. She watched the last coal crumble in the grate and understood him, quietly, in the way that a door when opened does not make a sound and you cannot say afterwards exactly when the room changed. The candles had been lit since 4 o'clock. Ashworth Hall did not entertain often, and so the dining-room, with its long table, newly dressed in white damask, and its 8 tall candelabra, had the slightly startled quality of a room recalled to life. Flowers had been cut from the glass house that morning, late roses, the last of the season, arranged in 3 low bowls along the sideboard. Eleanor stood at the window as the first carriage wheels sounded on the gravel drive. She smoothed her gloves and did not consider what she wore. She had learned in the months since her arrival that such thoughts were a form of consent. Lady Cecily Rowan arrived third. She always understood the correct position. Not first, which spoke of eagerness, and not last, which could be read as carelessness. She came between the others with the certainty of a sentence placed exactly to be heard. Her gown was deep green silk. She entered with the ease of a woman who had been welcomed here many times before, whose presence the house remembered. Eleanor watched from the hall doorway and felt something go very quiet in her chest. Not fear, readiness. At table, Cecily was superb. She did not attack. That would have been graceless. She inquired. She drew out each guest in turn, circled back to old acquaintance, and let conversation find its own current. Then, with the lightest of redirections, she turned that current precisely where she wished. Eleanor watched her the way one watches a falcon working above an open field. Patient, very high. The rest of the table followed without knowing they did. The moment came between the fish course and the remove. Cecily set down her fork and turned to Eleanor with a smile full of warmth. "Your father was the Marsh vicar, was he not?" she said. She said it as one mentions the weather, conversationally, without weight. "How charming! I imagine the transition to Ashworth Hall has been quite overwhelming." A small silence settled over the near half of the table, not a loud silence, the kind that listens. Eleanor set down her glass. She did not hurry. "Not at all," she said. "A house is only as overwhelming as one allows it to be." Cecily's smile did not change. "How resourceful!" "One learns," Eleanor said, and lifted her glass once more. A moment passed. Cecily turned to the gentleman on her left, and the conversation moved on as though it had never paused. Eleanor looked at her plate. The fish was very good. She ate it. She did not look toward Edward. That had been Cecily's second trap, the one laid even before she spoke. To seek rescue was to confess the need of it. Eleanor had no such need. She had grown up in a vicarage where money was thin and dignity was not, where her father had shown her, by his own quiet example, that good character required no particular setting in which to demonstrate itself. She was her father's daughter. She did not require rescue. Down the table she was aware of the particular quality of the silence that followed. The other guests had seen something. They had watched Eleanor Marsh, Countess of Pembrook, set a glass upon a white cloth with complete composure and simply declined to be diminished. Lady Cecily, who was very clever, had not accounted for this. She had perhaps expected colour rising in cheeks, or a rejoinder slightly too quick, or, most useful of all, a glance toward the husband at the head of the table that would have told the room precisely how things stood. Edward had said nothing. He had not needed to. The dinner proceeded. The candles burned lower. By the time the last plates were cleared, the temperature of the room had shifted, by some degree too small to name precisely. Lady Cecily was by then charming the vicar of Woodham with considerable warmth and attention, which was its own kind of retreat. The carriages came in the dark. Their lanterns swung in the courtyard as the guests gathered their wraps and said their farewells. Eleanor stood at the top of the stone steps and let the cold settle around her shoulders. November had come fully into itself. The frost along the stone balustrade caught the light spilling from the open door. She heard Edward's step behind her. He came to stand beside her, looking out toward the drive as another carriage turned and rolled away. They watched it go in silence. The vicarage, he said quietly, was never a thing to be managed away. His voice carried the particular care she had come to recognize. It was the voice he used when he meant something precisely and was uncertain whether she would receive it. She understood him. "I know," she said. She rested her hand upon the stone balustrade, her fingers settling just beside his, not touching, but near enough that the cold stone between them held the warmth of both. "I have never thought otherwise," she said. The last carriage rolled away into the darkness. The lanterns disappeared behind the bare elms at the edge of the drive. Ashworth Hall grew quiet behind them, the candlelight through the open door steady and warm. She stood a moment longer than courtesy required. He did not move away. The frost lay cold along the balustrade between them, and neither retreated. The morning after the dinner party, Ashworth Hall woke quietly, as it always did, to the sound of the house resuming its habits. The east window had begun at last to thaw. A pale line of water ran down the glass in the early light, and Eleanor stood a moment before it, watching the frost let go. Then she heard Edward's footstep in the corridor, precise, unhurried, punctual to the minute, and understood that something had changed. He was present at breakfast. He was correct at luncheon. He appeared at dinner with his customary courtesy, inquired after her morning, passed the salt without being asked, and said very little else. He was in all visible ways the same man she had met in London 9 months ago, seated beside an unlit fire in a room that smelled of beeswax. The door he had left ajar over these recent weeks was closed again, not locked, simply closed, with a decorous and considered hand. Eleanor was not surprised. She was, if she was honest with herself, a little awed. She had watched men retreat before. Her father retreated after sermons that had moved him too far. He would become brisk and occupied with ledgers for a day or two, as if the feeling required some balancing entry in an account he kept only to himself. But Edward's withdrawal was different in its precision. He managed the distance the way a careful man manages a hearth fire, tending it to ensure it would not go out, but also ensuring it would not spread. Every word was weighed, every silence was placed. He was not cold toward her, he was exquisitely, exhaustingly correct. And that was how she knew. She had learned his grammar over these months, slowly, in the way one learns a language spoken mostly in small rooms. She had learned that brevity meant discomfort, that the one corner of his mouth that moved was nearer to a laugh than any sound he made, that the still quality he wore in company was not indifference, but the careful management of a man who had learned that showing too much cost too much. She could read it now, and reading it was not entirely comfortable. The wall was not erected against her. That was what she had come to understand. The wall was erected because of her. She was in the kitchen passage on the third morning, a list of linen accounts in hand, when she encountered Mrs. Cavendish wringing a cloth beside the stove. The housekeeper did not look up at once, and when she did, her expression was the careful, neutral arrangement of a woman who has considered what she's about to say for some time. He was like this after his mother died, Mrs. Cavendish said. Not offered as comfort exactly, offered as information. Eleanor waited. Tidy, punctual. Mrs. Cavendish set the cloth aside and straightened the edge of it against the iron rail. He went through her rooms and catalogued every item. Took him 4 days. He did not weep once in my sight. She paused. It is how he grieves things he is afraid of. Eleanor did not ask her to clarify which category she fell into. She was fairly certain. She already knew. That evening she sat at the small writing table in her sitting room and began a letter to Harriet. She described Ashworth Hall in the first thaw, the frost lifting from the east window, the pale sun that had appeared for the first time since November, the way the stone of the drive seemed to exhale after weeks of holding the cold. She described the kitchen garden, which the gardener believed might yield something worth keeping this year if the frost did not return. She described the house learning, cautiously, to be warm again. She did not describe Edward. She did not describe what she had come to understand in the kitchen passage. Some things did not yet have the shape required for a letter. She folded the pages carefully and set them in the drawer. She would write another version when she had found the right words for it. At dinner he asked her, with perfect courtesy, whether she had walked that afternoon. She said she had gone as far as the East Gate. He said the road would be clearer in another week. She agreed. They applied themselves to their plates. The footman withdrew to the sideboard. Eleanor set her knife down with great deliberateness. "You need not manage the distance quite so precisely, my lord," she said. "I am not going anywhere." There was a long pause. He did not look up at once. When he did, his expression was the one she associated with the moments that cost him most, not cold, not closed, but containing something too large for the available space. "I am aware," he said. "That is rather the difficulty." Neither of them spoke again for the remainder of the meal, but the silence was a different kind of silence than any that had come before it. It had the quality of something acknowledged. She returned to her sitting room, took the unsent letter from the drawer, and did not reread it. She only set it on the desk beside the lamp and let the light fall across it, as if the house itself might be keeping it warm until she was ready. The sitting room held the kind of quiet that gathers late in a house that has learned to stop pretending. Eleanor sat at the writing desk with a lamp pulled near and an unfinished letter to Harriet spread open before her. She had written 3 sentences and crossed out 1. The fire was low. The east window had gone dark early, as it always did in winter. The last of the frost lay across it still, a pale tracery she had long since stopped finding strange. She heard the knock at the door and knew it was not the footman's. A footman's knock came in 2 quick raps, efficient and even. This knock came once, paused, and came again. It was the knock of a man who has considered whether to knock at all. She set down her pen and waited. "Come in." Edward Ashworth entered with the bearing of a man who has rehearsed his first sentence and already knows it will not serve him. He stood just inside the door, straight as he always was, dressed for an evening already long over. He looked at her across the lamplight with an expression she had seen only once before, in the study, over a dead man's letter. Then he had said the words, "It changes nothing," in a voice that understood it changed everything. "Forgive the hour," he said. "The hour is not so very late, my lord." He moved further in, not to the chair she would have offered, but to the edge of the room's centre, where the lamplight reached him. The dark pressed at his back. He looked at the letter spread open on her desk. He looked at her hands beside it. He was quiet, in the way of a man who has learned that speaking too early costs him more than waiting. "I have come," he said at last, "to discuss our arrangement." Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "The original terms were quite clear, my lord, a nominal arrangement, separate lives with the courtesies of a shared house." "They were," he said, "quite clear. And yet you have come to discuss them." "I should like," he said carefully, "to revise them." She waited. The fire shifted, a single ember dropping. He drew a short breath and began again. "I find I cannot." And he stopped there. He pressed his lips together. He looked at the east window as if the frost there might offer him the word he needed, and it did not. "Edward," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. She heard it land between them. She felt the small shift in the room's temperature. He turned to look at her. "Say it plainly. You have never been afraid of plainness before." He crossed the room. He did not sit. He stood at the side of the writing desk, close enough that she could see the faint tension at his jaw, the care he was taking. He said, "I married you to bury a scandal. I cannot bury what this has become. I have tried. For some months I have tried with some dedication and considerable discipline, and I am not able to continue trying." Eleanor was very still. "Are you telling me," she said, "that the marriage is real?" "It has been real for some time." He paused. "And I have been a great coward about it." "You have," she said, and reached across the desk and took his hand. He looked at her hand on his with the expression of a man who has been cold for so long that warmth feels like a thing to be verified. He did not pull away. He did not speak. He looked at their joined hands. He turned his hand beneath hers slowly and held it. They remained like that a long while. The lamp burned without guttering. The fire gentled to a glow, and no one came to tend it. Neither of them moved to call for anyone. Outside the east window, some slow change was beginning. The frost was drawing back by degrees from the dark glass, releasing its grip pane by pane. The house itself seemed to let out a long breath, as if it had been holding one since September, and had only now been given permission to rest. Edward said nothing more. This suited them both. Some things had been spoken into existence and did not require improvement at all. She felt the warmth of his hand and listened to the house settle. The old beams contracted. The wind found a new quarter outside. She found that the silence was an entirely different kind from the silence of their first evening. The table had been far too long then, and the cutlery too loud. Neither of them had known yet what they were learning. She thought of the letter to Harriet spread open on the desk. She had been trying for 3 weeks to describe Ashworth Hall honestly, and had not yet managed it. She would write a new one in the morning. It would begin in a different place entirely. The words would come easily now. She folded the unfinished pages along their crease and set them aside. The lamp went on burning, and the east window went on clearing, and the room was very quiet and very warm.